Where does the Supreme Court get off deciding the definition of marriage? Well, it is kind of their job. Look at it this way. Remember a few years ago when Pluto stopped being a planet and became a trans-Neptunian dwarf? It was a difficult time, I know. But how did that happen? Nothing about Pluto itself changed. The only thing that changed was the definition of the word planet. That definition wasn't put before voters, or politicians, or courts, or even before Bill Nye. It was a decision by a bunch of experts, the International Astronomers Union, because they're the ones who get to decide what astronomical terms mean when astronomers are in conflict. In the same way, the Supreme Court are the ones who get to decide what legal terms mean when there's a conflict between the Constitution and the law. When it came to Pluto, some people said it should be a planet, others said it was an ice dwarf, others said it was a Pluton or Plutoid. Ultimately, it was the IAU who got to decide because they're the experts who are qualified to settle these kinds of arguments. And thank goodness, because politicians were trying to butt into the process. The California State Assembly passed a resolution calling the Pluto designation heresy, and New Mexico passed a resolution that Pluto is a planet, but only when it is visible from New Mexico. It was astronomers who got to decide whether Pluto's a planet because they're the ones who actually know what they're talking about, unlike politicians throwing around heresy accusations who probably wouldn't know a trans-Neptunian Kuiper belt object if it hit on them at a bar. In the same way the IAU gets to decide the definition of planet, the Supreme Court gets to decide whether laws are constitutional, because that's what they're qualified to understand. Does the Constitution require that same-sex couples be allowed to marry? Well, gee, why don't we ask the people who spent their entire careers studying the Constitution, rather than voters or politicians trying to raise money for the next election, or even Bill Nye? Although, if we did ask him, he'd probably be in favor.
There's a spectrum. Some people are more inclined to have sex with people of their same sex than others. Let's celebrate being alive, everybody.
Now, obviously, language evolves and meanings change, but there are official parties who get to decide the meaning of technical terms in science and law. Look what happens when non-experts try to tinker with words. Here's Pat Fagan, a talking head with the Family Research Council, proposing a brilliant idea.
If you're talking about gay marriage, you call it garage. Instead of garage instead of marriage.
All right, problem one is that garage already means something, so that would be a little confusing. What else have you got?
If it's lesbian, marriage? Larriage. Or if you want a generic homosexual marriage, it's harriage.
Okay, great idea. Instead of people deciding to marry, you want them to Gary, Larry, or Harry. This sounds like the setup to a dirty joke. And where is this supposed to stop? Can I decide that Pat Fagan is not married, but instead farried? No, I don't have to. It's not my job to decide what civil marriage is. When there's a dispute over what qualifies as marriage under the law, or anything about the law for that matter, there are already people set up to decide. Judges are qualified to judge laws. Astronomers are qualified to decide what planets are. As far as I can tell, the only decision Pat Fagan is qualified to make is whether he should grow a mustache, which I have to admit is working for him. It looks good. So far, Pluto's new designation hasn't caused it to fall out of the sky. On to New Mexico. The institution of marriage hasn't dissolved. It would seem the experts actually knew what they were talking about. All it took was a little heresy. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments and on Twitter @MattBaum. And check out my book and podcast, Defining Marriage, for intimate personal stories from the last 40 years of fighting for the freedom to marry. Now, if you'll excuse me, Gary and Larry are coming over for dinner. Harry's not invited.